Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and I've published multiple best-selling books under the pen name Daniel Larson. Today, I'm going to share with you the differentiating factor between podcasters who are making 6 and 7 figures per year versus podcasters who are stuck with slow and steady growth, unable to generate real revenue and ROI for their business. Number one, top podcasters are completely obsessing over the episode titles, whereas a typical path for most business owners and entrepreneurs with podcasts is they see a title and they take good as being good enough. They maybe get a recommendation from an AI software that they've used to save them time and productivity, but then they fail to understand this one simple thing that the top 1% of podcasts totally get. Your episode titles is quite literally the only opportunity that you have to turn a total stranger into an active listener of your podcast. And it's also one of the only opportunities that you get in order to convince your current listeners to keep listening to your podcast. Now, why this is super important is because, when you're promoting your podcast on, let's say, social media, or you're sharing your podcast to your newsletter, if you're trying to drive people to take action and listen and click play to your episode, you need to have an irresistible episode title. So how the top 1% of podcasts do this is by adding massive curiosity, is by taking their time, by specifying the specific problem the episode is going to solve for the specific listener they're trying to reach. Not generic episode titles that fall flat. They don't really speak to a specific pain point. That's an AI has gave you, but the AI doesn't quite know the angle that's going to hit the hardest. And here's the thing, right? If you don't focus on episode titles, if you don't make it irresistible, what will happen is you spend all of this time, all of this effort, all of this energy, creating absolutely, genuinely good content. I hope it's good content. For the most part, it's good content, right? Amazing content. You might have the best guests on planet Earth. You might have just sat there for 20 minutes, an hour, spitting absolute game about your industry, whatever that might be. But if your episode titles falls flat, you won't be able to grab someone's attention and get them to take the action of clicking play and listening. Now, if you have a great content, but people aren't clicking play and listening, it doesn't matter how good your show is, the podcast simply won't grow. There's a reason why YouTubers have specific people working on their thumbnails and working on their episode titles or their video titles. For us as entrepreneurs and experts with a podcast, we have to do the exact same thing. And on the other side of that, when it comes to using the episode titles to drive way more growth, here's a practical example. If I just shared, how to grow your podcast 101, that's pretty boring, it's pretty basic, it's pretty generic, sounds something like AI. But if I said to you, steal these 3 strange tactics the top 1% are using to grow and explode their podcast growth, which one stands out? Which one's going to capture your attention? Which one is going to get more strangers online to click play and listen? So that's really the importance of that. And then on the other hand of it, when it comes to the episode titles, they obsess making sure that the episode titles is ranking high for podcast SEO, making sure they have specific search terms and keywords in the episode titles. Now, podcast SEO is a process of ranking your podcast and show high on Apple and Spotify. Apple and Spotify are the main platforms new listeners go to discover a new show. So when you're able to add the right keywords, the right search terms in your episode titles, it means your episode can be found and listened to by high intent listeners, the people who are actively searching for your content. So again, for myself, if I made a show like this, it'd be about podcast growth and monetization, making sure those keywords are in my title. For you, if your podcast is about how to reduce anxiety, the keyword there would be how to reduce anxiety. So when you're creating episode titles before or after the episode is done, you're thinking to yourself, what are the specific search terms a new listener will type in order to find my show? Then making sure you have those keywords and those search terms in your episode titles. The top 1% of podcasts are doing this on a consistent basis because they know that podcast SEO is quite literally free organic traffic that allows their show to be discovered by thousands of active new listeners each and every month. The second thing that I've noticed that differentiates entrepreneurs and experts making 6 and 7 figures per year with their show is a simple mindset shift right here. Most podcasters, when they're trying to grow their podcast, they obsess over getting more exposure for their show, which sounds good, right? I should promote on social media and I should get a high profile guest onto my podcast because in doing so, they're likely to bring their audience to me. However, we both know social media doesn't help you grow, and getting high profile guests on, whilst it sounds good in theory, it's terrible when it comes to practically growing the show, because oftentimes the guests don't promote the podcast, and the guests themselves, even when they do promote the podcast, their audience sometimes don't come. The episode basically performs the exact same. And the reason why is because most podcasters, those who are struggling to grow and monetize, they're kind of focusing on, again, trying to get exposure for their podcast. Now you might be thinking, look, and yeah, duh, no shit, that's exactly what I'm meant to do. I'm meant to get exposure for this podcast and thing I'm trying to grow. Now, whilst again, it sounds good in theory, what the top entrepreneurs and experts know that others don't, people like Alex Hormozy, Amy Porterfield, Pat Flynn, all of these figures who are growing their personal brand and growing their audience, they understand that there's more power not in trying to generate the exposure and attention for their show, but rather simply identifying where their audience already are and then placing themselves in front of that audience in a way where they can capture the attention of the listeners they want to reach. So instead of them relying on high-profile guests to bring in an audience to them, they just ask themselves, okay, what are other top podcasts in my industry and niche who already have the audience I would love access to? How can I be a guest onto their show and provide value to their audience and turn some of their audience into my own? How can I get the spotlight on me so I'm not trying to generate the attention, I'm simply placing myself in front of the attention that already exists. I'm capturing the exposure that's already there. Again, it's a simple mindset shift that really changes your relationship with how you approach your podcast growth strategy. Again, focus on where are my audience already at. And that's why with the first tip that I mentioned when it comes to episode titles, they really obsess over capturing the attention. Not just when they're promoting their show and someone sees their title, they capture that attention because the episode title is so irresistible, but also when they optimize their show and podcast to be discovered by new listeners on Apple and Spotify, when they optimize their podcast for podcast SEO. It means they are simply tapping into the organic traffic that's already going to specific keywords. They're adding those keywords in the episode titles. They're then ranking for those keywords and they're being shown, they're being recommended on Apple and Spotify to the right listeners who are already searching for their content. Once again, they're not generating that attention, they're simply placing their podcast in front of the right listeners who are already there. So that's the second thing. They focus on capturing attention that's already there instead of trying to generate constant exposure and attention to their podcast. And then the third and final thing, and this one is huge, having worked with literally hundreds of podcasters and having spoken to quite literally thousands of podcasts, this is a huge one. And this can really make or break how fast your podcast is able to grow and monetize. And it's this simple thing. The top entrepreneurs and experts were making 6 and 7 figures. And again, for us, we generated $120,000 in profit from our podcast while your podcast isn't growing. We'll use that podcast as a lead generation tool, as a business asset to drive more business into our high ticket coaching program. And it's extremely profitable. And again, the top experts and entrepreneurs, they do the same thing. They have a mindset that their podcast is a business. They're not just investing years into their podcast without driving meaningful ROI. For them, it's a business asset that's driving more business. They're using it to target the right listeners, to attract potential clients and customers, to nurture those clients and customers at scale as a podcast grows, and to convert those listeners into high-paying clients and customers over time. It's not just something to do for fun. So what does a simple mindset shift allow you to do? From going from I just have a podcast that's fun, that I love and I enjoy it, to no, this is a business asset that needs to drive ROI, that needs to drive more revenue for myself and for my team. This allows them to think about the podcast in a different way. Whereas most podcasters and entrepreneurs, might think to themselves, I've been doing the podcast for 2 to 3 years. I'm not generating any revenue. So why would I invest into coaching or an expert, or why would I invest into my education when the podcast hasn't generated any revenue? But think about that for a second. If you've been doing the podcast for the last 2 to 3 years and the podcast isn't growing, the likelihood is because you don't have the right strategy and the right systems in place. You've been working hard, you've been working consistent, but clearly something's off. The top podcasts, the entrepreneurs and experts who are making 6 and 7 figures, they see that and they ask themselves, okay, cool, well, this is a business. I need the business to grow and also generate revenue. Currently is not doing that because I don't have a strategy. Who can I go and pay in order to give me their growth system, to give me their growth strategies, to give me their expert guidance so I can take things to the next level, so I can start growing and making more money from their show? So that's really it. They treat their podcast as if it's a business asset and they invest the exact same way. They look at things from an ROI perspective and they obsess over finding the right strategies and systems in place and making the investment required into their show in order to start making an ROI from their podcast. Again, a return on investment on their show. So look, to recap, top entrepreneurs and experts with a podcast that's generating real revenue for their business, they, number one, obsess over the episode title. They make it wildly attractive and irresistible for the listeners they're trying to reach. They don't rely on generic AI title, and they definitely know that good isn't good enough, because the episode title is quite literally the only thing a new or old listener can use to decide whether or not to listen to your episode. Is what drives growth and is what makes your marketing way more effective in turning more strangers into active listeners of your podcast. They also obsess over making sure they have the right keywords, the search terms within the episode titles, ensuring that when a new listener types in on Apple and Spotify, that they are actually ranking, that they get shown, they get displayed. Because if not, that's a ton of free traffic that they're losing out on. That's lost opportunity to reach the right listener who would absolutely love the content you've produced. Number two, they obsess over capturing attention instead of just trying to generate attention by promoting on social media or having high-profile guests on their podcast or promotional clips. They ask a simple question: the listeners I want to reach, where are they already? How are they discovering new podcasts? What other podcasts are they listening to? They then place themselves in front of that audience, provide the value that they need to, and capture the attention that's already there. And then finally, entrepreneurs and experts who are making 6 and 7 figures, which shouldn't be, this shouldn't be rocket science, right? They treat their podcast like a business, and they invest in their podcast if they want to start seeing more real ROI. This is a mindset shift that screws up so many podcasts, because they think, I'm only going to invest into the podcast when it's generating more revenue. But the reason why the podcast isn't generating more revenue is because you don't have the right strategy, the right system, or the right team in place. And to get to that point, you have to invest in yourself. You have to invest into the podcast to take it to that next level. That's where the growth and monetization starts to happen. So look, my name is Anthony Ranieri. You've been absolutely fantastic, and I hope you found this valuable. If you have, be sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any specific questions around how any of this applies to your specific show, leave a comment down below. I'll reply to every single one. And with that being said, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.